Yo, what's going on YouTube? Go to Grind back here with another one. Today I've got a very special build for you guys. Personally, I'm split between choosing a variant of this or our previously showcased Razorwing spec. Just because I feel like both are well-rounded and have a very high potential for in-game, the only main difference is going to be in personal playstyle preferences, as our build today is going to be a fast-paced close-range melee focus that allows us to not only shred any content in front of us, but also tank anything Vessel of Hatred decides to throw our way. In a lot of ways, this build reminds me of our old Terminator rogue, and for that reason, I like to call this variant Rake-Zilla, as it is primarily centered around the core skill Rake. Using this skill coupled with a few other factors, we are able to go ahead and deal devastating critical strike damage whilst maintaining a heavy damage reduction and survivability total that allows us to become a true walking arsenal. If you're looking for a Spiritborn build that's going to allow you to not only decimate the leveling process, but also carry you well into in-game content, then look no further, for this is the build for you. Before we get into specifics, I do want to take a short moment to give a bit of background on how the Spiritborn's mechanics function. The Spiritborn has 4 types of spirit animals, each with their own respective skills. The Jaguar incorporates fire damage and fast-paced multi-attacks. The Eagle channels lightning damage and hones in on mobility and benefiting from its enhancements. The Gorilla comes swinging heavy physical damage with high investments in damage reduction and other forms of mitigation. And last but not least, the Centipede harbors a deadly bite utilizing a toxic poison, which pairs perfectly with a myriad of debuffs. In addition to each spirit having its own respective skills, they also grant specific class bonuses, each applying a specific passive effect to aid you in your progression, similar to the Druid's spirit boons. The Spiritborn can select a primary and secondary bonus at will with no restrictions on mix and matching outside of personal preference and potential build synergies. Your primary bonus is unlocked at level 15, and later on at level 30, your secondary slot is unlocked for you to socket your final spirit bonus. The Spiritborn's main resource is called Vigor. In addition to Vigor, the Spiritborn introduces 2 new proc effects, the first being Ferocity, which increases your attack speed by 5% per stack, up to 4 times each stack, lasting 4 seconds, and the second being Resolve, which increases your damage reduction by 20% while at least 1 stack is active. Taking direct damage will consume a stack of Resolve, and the base amount of stacks is set to 8, but as we will see later, you can increase this amount as well as synergize off of it to create a pretty interesting build combination. Now before we dive right into the skills here, I want to mention that if you've watched either of my previous guides, we're kind of following the same sort of concepts and ideals when it comes to our multiplicative damage factors and the way that we scale our overall damage output. Meaning you should have a bit of a leg up on understanding as to how some of the mechanics of the build actually are going to function and tie together. The main way in which this build differs from the previous 2 that I've showcased is in its fundamental playstyle and gameplay loop. This build not only takes advantage of the Jaguar's fast-paced melee combat, but excels at it. In addition to this, it utilizes the Gorilla's heavy defensive side, as well as its synergies to further aid its damage. Whereas my previous build showcases have primarily been centered around projectiles and AoE damage. With that short introduction out of the way, let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at our skills. Following the same concepts of our last 2 builds, we are going to be picking up Rock Splitter. Due to the enhanced Rock Splitter form, we are able to gain an increased block chance value of 15% for 5 seconds, and whenever we block, we will gain 11 vigor. If you've watched the previous videos, then you should be aware of the synergies that we have taken advantage of with block chance as well as our crit damage to multiplicatively scale our overall crit damage based on the amount of block chance that we have. In addition to this, the primary reason as to why we choose Rock Splitter is granted by the Sharp Rock Splitter spec. This allows us to knock back enemies on our 3rd cast of Rock Splitter, in addition to granting us Resolve per enemy hit. We know that Resolve stacks grant us damage reduction while active. In addition to this, we've taken advantage of a synergy of aspects that allow us to multiplicatively scale our overall block chance and crit damage based on the amount of Resolve stacks that we have. Dropping down to our core skills section, as I mentioned previously, this is a build that primarily revolves around the core skill Rake. This is a melee attack that will slash in front of you, dealing a percentage amount of damage and then exploding for an additional amount of damage on top of that. Taking a look here at Enhanced Rake, this is going to allow us to gain the stacks of ferocity, which we talked about a little bit earlier in our mechanic breakdown. These stacks of ferocity are going to allow us to increase our overall attack speed by 5% additive per stack. This effect can stack up to 4 times and last for 4 seconds. In addition to this base benefit, we'll see here a little bit later on within this skill tree, we do have a passive that scales off of our ferocity stacks in order to multiplicatively increase our overall crit strike damage with Jaguar skills. Just above that, we do have Advantageous Rake. This is going to reset our longest active cooldown by 0.5 seconds whenever we hit at least one enemy with a Rake. Early on, this might be a little bit beneficial for some of our cooldowns, but later on towards late game, once you achieve more sources of cooldown reduction as well as cooldown resets, you could probably despec this to save yourself a point. Hopping around though to take a look at our passives, we are going to be picking up Vigorous for that increased vigor generation whenever we cast a core skill. This will be pretty important early on for our overall vigor upkeep, especially when we go ahead and pick up and reference this node right here, Balanced Exertion. This is going to allow our core skills to deal 15% more multiplicative increased damage at the cost of 9% more multiplicative vigor. Obviously, due to the fact that this build is centralized around our core skill Rake, this is a pretty big benefit, and early on will allow you to scale that initial damage source, which will in turn help us with not only our overall leveling process, but also our in-game content push. Moving on to our focus skills though, we are going to be picking up Soar for 2 reasons. One, it is our primary mobility skill, but secondly, it is innately going to be able to proc vulnerable on enemies, and if we go ahead and take a look at Enhanced Soar, this will allow us to gain an increased critical strike against the enemy that we most recently hit with Soar, and then if we don't hit any enemies with Soar, we will instead gain 50% increased movement speed for 3 seconds. Hopping up to Replenish Soar, this is actually going to allow Soar's cloud to remain around us for 4 seconds, and then continue to make enemies vulnerable. Like I mentioned, one of the main reasons that we're picking up Soar is to proc that vulnerable onto enemies around us, so this is just going to further serve to aid that. Let it be noted that if you don't really need the Vuln proc itself, let's say you're using Razor Wings and that has a high enough potential to upkeep that Vuln itself, then you wouldn't necessarily need Soar. You could go ahead and spec into something like Rushing Claw, but the idea with this build is to eventually get Scorn of the Earth and use those, allowing us to proc our Soar as an evade. When it comes to our passives, we are going to be picking up Mirage. This grants a 60% increased dodge chance during evade, and whenever we dodge, we are going to gain an increased critical strike chance value of 15% for 3 seconds. Early on, this is going to help fill that critical strike chance gap. This is a critical strike build, so obviously we're going to want to have as high of a chance to actually proc our damage, so this is going to help us a little bit with mitigation till we can achieve the gear to henceforth fill the gaps. Just above that, we have Unrestrained Power. This is going to allow us to deal 12% multiplicative increased damage while we are either unhindered or unstoppable. We do have multiple sources of unhindrance or unstoppable, some of which we will discuss here in just a second. Taking a look here at Toxic Skin, if you read the active benefit, you'll actually see that this specific skill is a potential source of unhindrance itself. However, you'll also notice that we don't have this skill socketed onto our skill bar simply due to the fact that we aren't using it for its active benefit, but rather its passive. This allows us to spread poison damage to enemies that attack us in a similar mannerism to the way in which Thorns works. This is important as later on we'll see, due to taking advantage of one of our Spirit Hall bonuses, we have one of our main sources of healing coming from actually poisoning enemies. Sliding down to our defensive section here, we are going to be picking up quite a few things here. First and foremost, Armor Hide. This grants us a numerous amount of benefits, The first of which allowing us to passively regenerate resolve every 5 seconds. When we look at the active benefit, we can see that this allows us to encase ourselves, granting ourselves unstoppable and gaining 100% block chance. Like we mentioned before, we do need that source of unstoppable or unhindrance to proc that unrestrained power passive. And like we mentioned previously, any block chance that we gain is going to multiplicatively scale our overall crit strike damage due to a pairing of aspect synergies, so this is actually pretty important. Hopping up to Enhanced Armor Hide, we can see that in addition, whenever we have Armor Hide active, we will actually be able to gain maximum resolve just innately. And as we mentioned previously, due to the fact that we have an aspect that converts our resolve stacks into overall block chance percentage, we can henceforth then increase our critical strike damage even more. This allows us to consistently upkeep that permanent benefit, especially when we go heavy investing into our overall resolve stacks, potentially increasing the amount from 8 to 16, 24, or even more, depending upon how many overall maximum resolve stack affixes you put on your gear. Next up is Adaptable Armor Hide. Due to the fact that we don't have many overall healing sources and we have to wait till level 30 to unlock our secondary Spirit Hall benefit, we're choosing this to allow us to heal for 5% of our maximum life whenever we evade through enemies with Armor Hide active. When it comes to our next defensive skill, we have Counterattack. This passively grants us 10% dodge chance and automatically will retaliate against close enemies for 80% damage whenever we dodge their attacks. We aren't going to be paying attention to the active benefit here simply due to the fact that we don't even have this socketed onto our skill bar. Now if we pay attention to the counterattack enhancement, this does allow us to reduce the cooldown. However, once again, since we don't have it socketed, we aren't actually going to be paying attention to the cooldown because we aren't going to be using it. But if we take a look at Reinforced Counterattack here, this does passively increase our critical strike damage by 6% multiplicatively for every close enemy up to an overall value of 30% multiplicatively. Once again, since this is a crit strike damage focused build, this is a pretty good boost to damage, so that's why we pick it up. Taking a look at our first passive, we are going to be picking up Patient Guard for that increased block chance of 10%. This isn't a massive benefit, but like I said, because we scale our crit strike damage multiplicatively based on our block chance, we'll at least put 1 point in this to gain that initial benefit of 10%. Jumping down to our potency skills section, you can see that we are going to go ahead and pick up Razor Wings. If you saw my Razor Wings guide, then you should know that Razor Wings is essentially a projectile that mimics the way that, say, a boomerang would behave. Once you throw them out, they then rebound back to you. Due to the enhanced spec, Razor Wings are able to proc vulnerable whenever hitting with a critical strike or from behind. This is the main reason as to why we are speccing into Razor Wings itself, meaning if your vuln upkeep is perfectly fine and you have multiple sources to actually proc vulnerable itself, then you could entirely drop Razor Wings in order to pick up a defensive utility or offensive skill in exchange. Just above that, we have Invasive Razor Wings. This allows our wings to last 300% longer and grants them that spiral pattern that essentially grants us the whirlwinding effect of projectiles. Taking a look at our first passive here, we have Resilient. Whenever we cast a Gorilla skill, we are going to get 15% multiplicative increased maximum life. This is a little bit of survivability and defense added onto the build. If you have enough maximum life and your defenses aren't a problem, you're not struggling in that specific category of the build, by all means you could drop these 3 points and potentially gain some extra damage or utility. But moving on to our more important passives here, our raw damage passives, we have Potent. This is going to allow us to deal more damage with our Jaguar skills whenever we hit enemy with said Jaguar skills by 0.1% multiplicative up to a value of 10% multiplicative per rank. And below that we have Furnace. This allows us to multiplicatively scale our Jaguar skills critical strike damage per stack of ferocity that we have. Moving back up to take a look at Brilliance, we can see that this increases our Eagle scale damage by a multiplicative 24% of our movement speed, and our current bonus is at 48%. Just above that, we have acceleration, and this allows us to gain 15% additive increased movement speed for 4 seconds whenever we cast an eagle skill, and after we evade, our next eagle skill will deal 30% multiplicative increased damage. Even though the build is primarily centered around the Jaguar itself, due to the utilization of our primary Spirit Hall bonus being the Eagle, we are able to take advantage of these specific passives in order to make all of our skills Eagle skills, henceforth granting them additional damage. When it comes to our ultimate skills, due to the fact that we are using a primarily Jaguar centered build, we are going to go ahead and pick up the Hunter. You cast this ability, you're going to be able to spawn in a Jaguar that leaps onto the field and essentially does a whirlwinding slash attack. But looking at Harmonious Hunter, we can see that this allows us to overfill our ferocity by 4 stacks and causes us to deal 100% multiplicative increased damage to injured enemies whenever we have the Hunter active. When it comes to Exalted Hunter, this is going to give us a 40% chance to instantly reset our Hunter cooldown whenever we kill an enemy while Hunter is active, and then that chance is halved after each consecutive reset. Taking a look at our first passive here, we are going to have Resolution. When casting an ultimate skill, we get 15% multiplicative increased damage to elites for 3 seconds, which is then doubled if we're fighting only one enemy. Just above that, we have Spiritual Attunement. We're really only using this as a pathway node in order to get to Supremacy. Supremacy reads, any enemies you kill while an ultimate skill is active grants a stack of Supremacy, each increasing your damage by 3% multiplicative up to 30% multiplicative. When an ultimate skill ends, you gain 5 stacks of Supremacy, but you begin to lose 1 stack every second. Just below that, in order to gain access to our next passive, we are going to be picking up Sustenance. This does heal us for a slight amount whenever we hit enemies with ultimate skills. This could make up for some of the lack of healing that we'll have early game, so maybe pay attention to this node if you're struggling with your overall healing values. But moving on, here we have Intricacy, which if you watched our Razor Wings build, you'll know that this allows us to reset one of our potency, defensive, or focus skills to be then cast for free up to 3 times whenever we cast an ultimate skill. You might be wondering, if we aren't spamming Razor Wings, then what specific use case does this have? We'll pay attention to the fact that Soar is a focus skill, as well as the fact that Armor Hide is a defensive skill, both of which are important and have rather longer cooldowns, especially during the early game stages. So this can help gain extra casts of those skills to maintain the overall benefits that those skills provide. Finally, we do go ahead and put 1 point into initiative to help us upkeep our unstoppable. Also, I had 1 free point, so I just slapped it in here because why not? That is going to go ahead and round out the ultimate section of our skill tree. Moving on to our key passive, I do want to mention a few notes here. First of all, if you're struggling for that healing early on and you do have access to your key passive, you might want to opt out for something like Vital Strikes. The primary downside of this specific key passive is the fact that it does remove your vulnerable proc from enemies after dealing direct damage to them. Therefore, you would have to have a pretty efficient form of proccing vulnerable in order to bridge the gap that is going to be caused by this specific key passive. As long as healing isn't a problem, however, the specific key passive that I'm recommending for this build rendition is going to be Prodigy's Tempo. If you watched our previous guides, then you'll know that not only does this grant us 2 skill ranks whenever we consecutively cast the same basic skill 3 times, but it will also refresh our cooldowns by 10%, increased by 2% for each of the skill ranks that are applied to the skill that you are consecutively casting 3 times to then reset a cooldown. This is pretty beneficial early on, especially due to the fact that we are, as a Spiritborn, more centered around our ultimate skill, which has a longer cooldown, and then in turn it does also help us with armor hide, as we are looking to maintain not only that 100% block chance bonus but also the upkeep on unstoppable. That is going to go ahead and round out the skill tree section of the video though, guys. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the aspect and affixes. I do want to note that, as I mentioned previously, a lot of the core concepts and synergies are very similar or exactly the same as my previous builds, so you should be able to grasp the overall concept and idea of what's going on here as I progressively break down my aspects and affixes. Getting us started off here then with our two-handed quarterstaff, we are going to be picking up the aspect of unyielding hits, specifically due to the fact that this allows us to convert our armor into additional weapon damage. This is the equivalency of having an extra weapon, higher IP, or extra damage per second. You'll also notice that once again we are stacking that critical strike damage in order to boost our overall damage even further, due to the fact that we do have several factors boosting that bucket entirely. You'll also notice that we are getting that chance for Rake to extra hit. That's essentially a doubling of our damage whenever that proc hits, so that is important due to the fact that we are a Rake centralized build. Jumping up to take a look at our boots here though, we do have the aspect of Fleet Wings. This allows our Razor Wings to now also be an incarnate skill that allows us to passively gain unhindered, and while active, our Razor Wings will grant us 35% additive movement speed per individualized wing. Like I mentioned previously, the idea here is to get the Scorn of Earth unique boots in order to make your soar your evade, and then henceforth go through the entire dungeon or whatever form of content you're progressing through, soaring, and then proccing vulnerable on all enemies around you based off of that advanced spec of soar that I showed you in the skill tree section. Taking a quick look at our affixes, we can see that we're stacking that movement speed in addition to our overall rake size, as we are once again a rake centralized build. We do go ahead and pick up that armor, which henceforth is giving us defense but also even more weapon damage due to the unyielding hits aspect that we just referenced on our two-hander, and of course our main stat dex. Jumping up to our pants, we're going to have the aspect of interdiction. This is what allows us to stack that block chance based on the amount of resolve stacks that we have, and in turn increase our overall crit damage bucket relative to said block chance. Glancing at our affixes, we are going to pick up resistance to all elements, as we don't have very many options in regards to picking that overall resistance up that we do need. We got to get at least one or two affixes of that. If you have, say, Ethereals or something of that variety, of course your resistance values wouldn't really be bothered, but in our circumstances we are going to have to go ahead and pick up at least one or two affixes of resistance to all elements in order to get caps, especially as soon as we start to push the higher torment tiers. Same sort of stuff in regards to the other affixes, but in regards to our tempers, we do once again have rake size, and then we have those maximum resolve stacks being increased, which once again is going to give us more block chance and in turn increase critical strike damage. When it comes to our gloves, we are going to be running the duelist aspect. This is going to increase our maximum ferocity, and as we know, not only does ferocity increase our attack speed, but also due to the furnace passive, we are going to gain increased critical strike damage with our Jaguar skills based on each stack of ferocity. When referencing our affixes, it's most important to go ahead and pick up those ranks to our core, Rake, and then we are going to go ahead and put a emphasis on crit strike chance, attack speed, that critical strike damage once again, and then an additional rake size. Just above that, we are going to have our chest piece rocking the aspect of disobedience. Now, since we do have that unyielding hits aspect on our two-hander, that's going to give us increased weapon damage based on the overall amount of armor that we have. Therefore, this specific aspect seems to be one of the best ways to get that value increased on an exponential level. And then referencing our affixes, we have sort of the same thing going on here once again, but the most important one is we have ranks to armor hide. That's going to increase the overall duration of armor hide, which does help us with that upkeep of unstoppable, as well as the block chance and our overall resolve stack upkeep as well. When it comes to our final armor piece, the helm, we are going to be running the Juggernauts aspect, as this pairs with the unyielding hits aspect in order to give us increased weapon damage based on the overall amount of armor that we have. And once again, the way that the unyielding hits aspect actually works, as far as we know, is it essentially is the equivalency to having an extra weapon, extra IP, or extra damage per second. So if you have that aspect, you'll essentially be able to gain the same amount of damage that we had previously to the cut in damage per second on our weapon values. Let it be noted that the idea for the helm is to eventually switch this out for the Harmony helm, which is pretty much, in my opinion, one of the best helm, if not the best helm in the game for the Spiritborn class specifically. But moving on, taking a quick look at our affixes, we have basically the same sort of thing. However, we do have that cooldown reduction. I mean, you could essentially swap that out for anything. That could even be Dex, but I'm just going to throw a little bit extra cooldown reduction on there to sort of simulate what would otherwise be a Shaco. Hopping over here to our amulet though, you can see that we are going to go ahead and run redirected force for our aspect. This is what allows us to convert our block chance into multiplicative critical strike damage, and then whenever we block an enemy, that is going to double the overall bonus that this aspect grants. It's a pretty good aspect if you ask me, and if you're a specific crit-centered build, this is probably one that you're going to want to have on your equipment regardless. When it comes to our affixes, we're pretty much going to go ahead and try to look for those triple passives, as those are our highest benefiting damage multipliers, and since we can take advantage of all three of them right out the gate, that's what I'm recommending. You could potentially get, say, total armor or dex if you wanted to, but these are the ones that are going to give you the highest potential benefit. When looking at our tempers, we do see that we pick up the maximum resolve stacks again, and we continue to blast critical strike damage. Dropping down and taking a look at our first ring here, we are going to have the accelerating aspect. I know we do have a few sources of attack speed, especially when we take into account our ferocity stacks. However, early on, our gear isn't going to be as good, and attack speed is a multiplier on your damage. So we go ahead and pick this up in order to try to hit cap. If you're already capped at 100, then I'd recommend some other multiplicative source of damage. We are going to go ahead and prioritize critical strike chance for our affixes. In addition to attack speed and critical strike damage, we do go ahead and temper razor wing charges on here to aid us in that overall vuln application. I do want to note that alternatively, you could be picking up lucky hit chance to vuln and then allowing yourself to go ahead and drop the overall razor wing spec. I do have a build that instead uses, I believe, vortex or say counterattack. That's an entirely applicable change that you could make, so feel free to do so. Concluding our gear section here with our final ring, we are going to be running the aspect of Wild Claws, which allows our Rake to manifest the Spirit Jaguar, which also casts Rake at a random enemy, dealing 65% base damage. When it comes to our affixes, once again, we have the exact same thing, so there's not too much to discuss there. That does go ahead and wrap up our affix and aspect section of the video. So now we're going to go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about our spirit bonus choices. The first of which, our primary, being Eagle. This reads casting an Eagle skill, grants 4 seconds of Storm Feathers movement speed bonus. When you evade, fling up to 8 Storm Feathers for every remaining second, each dealing lightning damage and making targets vulnerable for 5 seconds. In addition to this bonus, and the main reason as to why we're going ahead and picking up Eagle as our primary spirit bonus, is because it is going to make all of our skills Eagle skills, which will allow us to take advantage of multiple passives and other multiplicative benefits that otherwise would be gated to our Jaguar skill. Our second Spirit Hall bonus is going to be Centipede. This allows us to heal for 1% of our maximum life for every nearby enemy we've poisoned in the last 3 seconds, up to 5%. And if you remember, we specifically went ahead and spec'd into that passive form of Toxic Skin in order to allow us to poison enemies. With that all having been covered, that's not only going to wrap up the affix and aspect section of the video, but also the Spirit Hall bonus section as well. Moving on, let's go ahead and take a look at our Paragon. Before we dive into taking a look at our boards as well as our glyphs, I do want to mention that this is specifically a starter leveling build. That means that you might not even have access to the Paragon at the time that you'll be using this specific spec anyways, so I'm not going to go too in depth into the actual nuances of the Paragon board setup itself. However, I would recommend pretty much copy and pasting it, and then I'll go ahead and go over all of the more crucial aspects, those of which being the legendary nodes and the glyphs as well as their functions. When it comes to our starter board, we are going to be running the Spirit Glyph. This is not only going to give us increased critical strike damage, but it's going to allow our critical strikes to increase the damage an enemy takes from us by 3% multiplicatively for 20 seconds, up to a total amount of 15% multiplicatively. Hopping up to our first board here, we have Drive. The legendary node reads, after moving 10 meters, you deal 3% multiplicative increased damage for 10 seconds, which can stack 10 times for a total value of 30% multiplicative. For the associated glyph, we are going to be running Colossal. This allows us to gain a small portion of gorilla damage, but most importantly, we are going to be gaining 2% multiplicative increased damage for each stack of Resolve. And since we are so highly invested into our Resolve stacks already, this only serves to further aid that investment and give us a bigger benefit from it. Hopping over to the left, our third board is going to be Convergence. The legendary node allows us to deal bonus damage equal to 20% multiplicative of our 2 highest bonuses to damage types combined, up to 30% total. This means we're going to take our 2 highest damage category types combined, and then based on their values, we will be granted a specific benefit up to a total of 30%. For our glyph, we do have Fitness. This is not only going to give us an increased amount of critical strike damage, but allow our skills that critically strike to generate 3 vigor. Our fourth board is going to be Sapping. When we cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, we will restore 15% of our vigor and deal 30% multiplicative increased damage for 5 seconds. Our glyph here is going to be Talon. Not only is this going to give us increased eagle damage, but it's going to allow our eagle skills to deal 15% multiplicative increased critical strike damage, and since we took advantage of that primary Spirit Hall bonus, all of our skills will be eagle skills. Last but not least, for our fifth and final board, we do have Revealing. The legendary node reads Lucky Hit up to a 30% chance to knock down vulnerable enemies, and we deal 30% multiplicatively increased damage to crowd control enemies. And for our final glyph, we will be picking up Hone. This is going to give us increased Jaguar damage, as well as increased critical strike chance for our Jaguar skills, stacking up to a total of 10%, going by 1. That does conclude not only the Paragon section of the build guide, but the build guide in general. I want to thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Make sure to stay tuned for any additional guides and further iterations of this specific spec. I do plan on, within the next day, starting to release my unique, or rather in-game variants of the builds that I've already showcased. So if you're interested in any of those, or any other D4 Season 6 Vessel of Hatred related content, be sure to stay tuned by subscribing. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, don't forget to drop those down in the comment section. Once again, this has been Goated Grand. Thanks for watching, and peace out.